A law that was supposed to set your money free may have just done the opposite. In Florida, a bill was signed with promises of freedom, sound money, financial independence, but behind the press releases, something else was buried in the fine print. Coin dealers are worried. Vault operators are worried. Sound money advocates who fought for decades are sounding the alarm. Because what looks like liberty on the surface may be the opening chapter of a much bigger story about control. Who really wrote this law, and why does it benefit a handful of tech companies far more than the everyday investor? Stay with us, because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what's happening in Florida and why it may be coming to your state next. Welcome back to Precious Metals Intelligence, the channel built for investors, business professionals, and everyday Americans who refuse to be caught off guard by the fine print of economic policy. If you value strategic clarity over headlines, you're exactly where you need to be. Before we begin, we'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Drop your city or state in the comments below. It always means a great deal to see just how far this community reaches. And if this kind of independent, in-depth analysis matters to you, consider joining the channel by subscribing. It helps ensure this reporting continues to reach the people who need it most. In the early months of 2025, lawmakers in Florida introduced a bill that seemed, at first glance, like a major win for everyday people. It was called House Bill 1311. And it promised something that sound money supporters had wanted for years, an easier way to use gold and silver as real, spendable money. For decades, a small but passionate group of economists, investors, and everyday citizens had pushed for this idea. They believed that money should be backed by something real, gold, silver, tangible value, rather than paper currency created out of thin air by a central bank. This belief is often called sound money. Its supporters trace their thinking back to well-known free market economists who argued that government should never stand between a person and their right to trade in honest money. For years, this movement made slow progress across the country. A handful of states removed sales taxes on gold and silver purchases. Others debated similar ideas, but most bills stalled, stuck in committee rooms, or buried under other legislative priorities. Florida seemed different. Florida seemed ready to lead. When HB 1311 came to the table, it was pitched as something bigger than a small tax adjustment. It promised to give ordinary Floridians a real modern way to use gold and silver in daily life. Under this new law, people could theoretically use gold-backed debit cards, mobile apps, and digital platforms to pay for groceries, gas, or rent, all while the value of their money stayed tied to a physical metal, not a currency that could lose value overnight. To many observers, this sounded like a giant leap forward. It fit perfectly with the political image that Florida's leadership had built for itself, a state that valued independence, personal freedom, and distance from federal financial control. When Governor Ron DeSantis signed the bill into law, the moment was treated as historic. Advocates celebrated. Financial commentators praised the move. Headlines called it a bold step toward economic sovereignty. For a brief period, it looked like Florida had done what other states could only talk about. It looked like the state had found a way to bring sound money principles into the modern economy, using new technology to make old, trusted forms of value more accessible than ever before. But not everyone was celebrating. Even before the governor's signature had dried, a very different reaction began forming behind the scenes. Organizations that had spent years fighting for sound money, groups that should have been the loudest supporters of this bill, were instead raising red flags. One of the most vocal was the Sound Money Defense League, an organization long known for supporting exactly the kind of reforms HB 1311 claimed to represent. Instead of praise, they issued warnings. Instead of celebration, they sent letters. Their message was simple but urgent. Something inside this bill did not match its public image. They were not against the idea of gold-backed payment platforms. They were not against innovation in how people used precious metals. Their concern was something deeper, something buried in the legal language most people would never take the time to read. This is where the story becomes far more complicated than a simple win for financial freedom. On paper, HB 1311 looked like it was expanding rights. In practice, critics argued, it may have been expanding government control instead, quietly and in a way most Floridians would not notice until it was too late. Why would a bill designed to free gold and silver from restriction actually add new layers of government oversight? Why would advocacy groups that had fought for this cause for decades suddenly turn against a law that used their own language, their own goals, and their own reputation to gain public support? The answer lies not in what the bill promised, but in what it actually did, buried deep inside pages of dense legal text that most lawmakers, and certainly most citizens, never fully examined before it became law. To understand how a bill meant to expand freedom may have done the opposite, it becomes necessary to look past the headlines and the signing ceremony. It becomes necessary to examine the actual mechanics of the law, the specific changes it made to how gold and silver businesses operate in the state of Florida. Behind every headline, there is always a document, and documents rarely lie the way press releases do. To understand what actually happened with House Bill 1311, it helps to set aside the celebration, the political photos, and the public statements. What matters is the text of the law itself, the part almost nobody outside of a courtroom or a lobbyist's office ever bothers to read line by line. When analysts and industry experts finally sat down with the full bill, they found something surprising. HB 1311 did not simply remove old barriers to using gold and silver as money. Instead, it expanded a completely different area of Florida law, the state's rules for something called money services businesses, often shortened to MSBs. To most people, that term means very little, but to anyone in the financial industry, it carries serious weight. MSB rules were originally designed for large-scale financial operations, companies that transfer money across borders, currency exchange services, and wire transfer networks like the ones used to send funds internationally. These are businesses that regulators have long worried could be used, intentionally or not, for money laundering or fraud on a massive scale. Under HB 1311, this same category of strict regulation was extended to cover something very different: local coin shops, bullion dealers, and precious metal depositories. This is where the story shifts from technical detail to real-world consequence. Picture a small coin shop in a Florida town. The owner buys and sells gold coins, silver bars, and collectible currency across a glass counter. Most of their customers are local residents, retirees protecting their savings, small investors diversifying their portfolios, or hobbyists building a collection. This is not a global financial network. It is a small business, often family-owned, built on trust within a community. Under the new law, that same small business owner may now be required to follow a set of rules once reserved for banks and wire transfer companies. This includes obtaining special state licenses, undergoing formal state examinations, building out full compliance programs, and submitting ongoing reports to regulators. For a large financial institution, these requirements are simply part of doing business. Banks already have legal teams, compliance departments, and the resources to manage this kind of oversight. But for a small coin shop, these same requirements can represent a serious financial and operational burden. Hiring compliance staff, paying licensing fees, and preparing for state audits all cost money and time that a small business may not have. What makes this development even more puzzling is something easy to overlook. These businesses were not operating without oversight before HB 1311. Precious metal dealers in Florida were already required to follow federal anti-money laundering laws. They were already bound by the Bank Secrecy Act, a federal law designed to prevent financial crimes. They were already required to report certain transactions to the Internal Revenue Service, and they were already subject to Florida's existing consumer protection laws. In other words, a regulatory foundation already existed. It was not new, and it was not weak by design. Yet HB 1311 added an entirely new layer on top of it, without offering clear evidence that the previous system had failed or fallen short in some specific way. This raises an uncomfortable question. If the existing rules were already working, why did lawmakers feel the need to add more? And why did this new layer of regulation target small, local businesses instead of the large-scale financial operations that MSB rules were originally designed to monitor? For many people watching this unfold, the language of the bill began to feel less like consumer protection and more like a mismatch, a set of rules borrowed from one industry and applied, almost without adjustment, to a completely different one. It is one thing to regulate a company that moves millions of dollars across international borders every day. It is another thing entirely to apply those same standards to a neighborhood shop selling a handful of silver coins to a retired customer on a Tuesday afternoon. This gap between the bill's stated purpose and its actual legal mechanics is where the real story begins to take shape. Because laws are rarely written by accident. Every requirement, every licensing rule, every reporting obligation exists because someone specifically wrote it into the bill. Which raises the next, more important question in this story. Who exactly wrote these provisions? And why did they choose to shape the law this particular way? That answer leads directly into the most important part of this investigation. Every law has an author, and every author has a reason. To understand House Bill 1311, it becomes necessary to ask a question that rarely gets asked in the excitement of a bill signing. Who actually wanted this law to pass, and what did they stand to gain from it? According to research from J.P. Cortez, the executive director of the Sound Money Defense League, the answer points in a direction few people expected. The push behind HB 1311 did not primarily come from coin shop owners, vault operators, or everyday investors. Instead, much of the momentum appears to have come from financial technology companies, specifically firms that had already built gold-backed payment platforms. This detail matters more than it might seem at first. These companies were not waiting on new legislation in order to operate. Their gold-backed cards and apps were already fully legal under existing Florida law before HB 1311 was ever introduced. They did not need permission to exist. They were already doing business. So if these companies did not need the law to operate, what did they actually want from it? The answer, according to those who studied the bill closely, was legitimacy, a formal, state-approved status, something that could be used as a stamp of approval, a way to tell potential customers, investors, and business partners that their platform had been recognized and blessed by state government itself. In a competitive and fast-growing industry, that kind of official recognition can become a powerful marketing advantage. It signals trust, it signals credibility. And in financial technology, trust often translates directly into customer growth and higher valuations. This is not necessarily illegal, and it is not automatically dishonest. Companies frequently work to shape favorable regulatory environments for themselves. But the way this particular effort played out created a significant side effect for an entire industry that had nothing to do with digital platforms at all. In the process of securing that stamp of approval, the legislation appears to have swept traditional physical bullion dealers into the same regulatory category. Local coin shops that had never touched a digital gold-backed card were now placed under the same strict rules designed for entirely different business models. These smaller traditional dealers found themselves facing new costs and new compliance burdens, not because their own business practices had changed, but because a separate industry wanted formal recognition for its own products. What makes this situation especially concerning to critics is how the bill came together. Reports on the legislative process suggest that established coin dealers, vault operators, and sound money economists were not meaningfully consulted during the drafting of HB 1311. Even some of the state regulators who would eventually be responsible for enforcing these new rules were reportedly left out of early conversations about how the law should be written. This raises a difficult but important point for anyone who follows economic policy. A law that affects thousands of small business owners and everyday investors was shaped in large part without meaningful input from the very people most affected by it. Instead, the loudest voices in the room appear to have belonged to companies with a direct financial interest in how the final language was written. This is the uncomfortable core of the HB 1311 story. A bill introduced under the banner of financial freedom appears, upon closer inspection, to reflect the priorities of a specific group of stakeholders whose success depended not on removing barriers for everyone, but on gaining an edge that smaller competitors could not easily match. And that raises the final larger question this story must address. What does this mean for the deeper principles that sound money was always supposed to represent? At its core, this story is not really about one bill in one state. It is about a much older and more important question. What does sound money actually mean, and who gets to decide? For decades, the people who fought hardest for sound money were not asking government to build new systems. They were asking government to step aside. Their argument was simple and consistent. Economists like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, along with modern political figures like Ron Paul, all shared a common belief. Honest money does not need permission from the state. It does not need a licensing office. It does not need a compliance department. It simply needs the freedom to exist without unnecessary interference. This is the standard that critics say HB 1311 failed to meet. The bill did not remove barriers between citizens and their right to use gold and silver. Instead, according to those who studied it closely, it added new ones. It replaced old restrictions with a different kind of restriction, dressed in more modern language. To understand what a genuine sound money policy actually looks like, it helps to consider a short list of principles that most advocates agree on. First, removing sales taxes on the purchase of gold and silver, something Florida had already accomplished before this bill, and something most advocates view as a real, meaningful win. Second, eliminating state-level capital gains taxes on precious metals, which would allow investors to buy and sell without being penalized for simply protecting their savings. Third, protecting financial privacy, so that ordinary citizens are not forced to reveal every detail of their personal transactions just to own a physical asset. And fourth, allowing people to trade freely, without needing special government licenses just to buy or sell metal that has always been considered a private form of value. Each of these principles shares one thing in common. They all focus on reducing government involvement, not expanding it. They treat gold and silver the way sound money advocates have always treated it, as private property, not as a financial product requiring state permission. HB 1311 moves in the opposite direction. By creating new licensing requirements, new state examinations, and new ongoing reporting obligations for coin dealers and depositories, the law expands the government's role in deciding who is allowed to participate in the precious metals market. It does not simply regulate fraud or protect consumers from bad actors. It creates a system where operating a small, honest business now requires clearing a much higher bureaucratic bar than it did before. This matters beyond Florida's borders. Sound money advocates have spent years trying to build momentum across the country, encouraging other states to follow similar paths toward reducing restrictions on gold and silver. Florida was seen as a leader in this movement, a state willing to go further than most. That reputation makes what happened here especially significant because other states may look to Florida's example when drafting their own legislation. If lawmakers elsewhere copy the structure of HB 1311 without understanding its deeper flaws, similar burdens could spread to coin dealers and small businesses in other parts of the country. A law that appears, on its surface, to support financial freedom could end up quietly working against it, simply because so few people took the time to read past the headline. This is why the outcome in Florida deserves close attention, not just from investors and business owners in that state, but from anyone who cares about how economic freedom is protected or eroded through legislation. A single bill, introduced with good intentions or shaped by narrower interests, can set a precedent that lasts far longer than the news cycle that surrounded its signing. The final question, then, is not simply what happens next in Florida. It is whether this moment becomes a lesson that strengthens future sound money legislation or a mistake that quietly repeats itself in other states across the country.